The D. Elliott from Canopy Software, Jillian Bomarito, who's the co-founder and CEO of Tech Diligence. Is that right? I think that's right, Jillian. We'll have all you guys introduce yourself as we sort of bring you into the conversation. But I'm going to let Christian sort of give a little introduction to this topic. And I think we're also going to have one more speaker maybe as well. So, Christian, why don't you go ahead and lead us off?
All right, so yeah, I gave a speech about this topic a few months ago, so I'm basically just rattling down the numbers that I have here in my slide. So last year, the cost of data breaches globally exceeded $6 trillion. As a frame of reference, it's larger than the GDP of Germany or Japan for that matter. Actually, there's only two GDPs in the world that are larger, but just the United States and China. The average cost for data breach, according to SourceForge, for a company totaled about $8.6 million. And the average time to identify a data breach in 2020, so this is not a last year number, according to IBM was 228 days. The average time to contain a breach was 80 days. In April of last year, a database emerged on the darknet that contained the personal data of more than 500 million Facebook users, which is an interesting thing. And also in the same time, almost the same day actually, a database emerged that had the personal data of 500 million Zoom people. So if you're using that, change everything you have on there. On average, in the United States, there's a data breach a little more than an hour. I think it was like 65 minutes. So every 65 minutes, one company's database is being compromised. And we'll leave it there for the high-level data and talk about the interesting things that pertain to these topics.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting things there, Chris. Probably the most the dirtiest secret there might be, at least in my opinion, the fact that most companies don't even realize they've been breached until 6 to 12 months after the fact, which is just crazy. I mean, that means since breaches happen so often, that virtually every company is going to be breached within a year or two. Based upon statistics, right? That means that essentially, half of the companies that people here work for are probably already breached. There's somebody in our systems right now. It's just a statistical, certainty, which is crazy.
Right, and it has almost doubled due to the fact that a lot of people work from home. That just basically increased the surface structure for these type of attacks.
It's crazy. And and to give a little bit more perspective before we start into this, I posted a few sort of questions, posited a few questions in the post sort of leading up to this discussion, including some questions about court rulings that may sort of compromise a little bit of people's well, I guess the way some companies handle data breaches. There was a Mandiant FireEye Capital One ruling a couple of years ago, which essentially came to the conclusion that depending upon how companies research their data breaches, they may have to actually turn over that information to plaintiffs who sue them. And so if companies aren't careful about how they research their data breaches, they may actually be better off not even researching the data breaches, which is crazy. I mean, the incentives are all screwed up in that case, right? And so this judge who made this decision really is giving the whole industry, the whole topic, right, doing it a disservice because the incentives are terrible based upon that court decision, even though he was probably trying to do the right thing. Another piece there is that the whole data breach insurance system is pretty screwed up because now companies can go out and buy insurance, which is good because it's happening so often. But once they have insurance, they've now got potentially a false sense of security. And even worse than that, if companies who have insurance have those insurance companies paying off ransomware fees, then that potentially just encourages the ransomware thieves to continue doing what they're doing.
Yeah.
So these
Ultimately
are a couple
breaching
of
like their
questions that I'd like
databases and making
our
it a
guests
target
to
list.
address as we sort of move forward. And there are a couple more questions as well. So let's go ahead and start things off and get Steve from Hack Notice to introduce himself and tell us his thoughts on this subject.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. So, quick technology check. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, we can
Okay.
hear you.
Fantastic. So, Steve Thomas, CEO and founder of Hack Notice, and we've been in the space of identifying data breaches for a few years now. There's a lot of nuance to what you mentioned, Jeff. I think the most important is what you just mentioned about cyber insurance. It's really become a big question as to if you can even get it these days. Cyber insurers have been losing a lot of money, and it's precisely because ransomware has gone after small businesses and they've had to pay out a lot of claims. My business is a small business, and we are actually dropped from coverage because we were too small. And so we ended up getting different coverage, but we certainly had to work for it. So I think there's a lot of nuance going on around data breaches and certainly the economic impacts of it.
So, do
That's
you remember what the
interesting, Steve. Yeah,
threshold
I
was?
do know that there's a lot of upheaval in that business. It seemed to me that the insurance companies sort of rushed into the space, thought that they could make sort of maybe a quick buck, and now they're having to pull back because they were maybe a little bit too soft on offering that insurance, and now maybe they've pulled back too far. I don't know. What's your take though on insurance companies paying ransoms? Is
Yeah,
that
and
is that a
maybe,
good thing or a bad thing?
yeah, maybe Steve, do you remember what the threshold was? Did they tell you?
No, they just dropped us. I had to infer that they dropped us because we were too small, which was actually pretty funny because we were talking with insurance groups about how we could help them figure out which companies were risky or not risky to insure. So we were actually engaged with insurance groups to try to make the process better. And at the same time, we were dropped from coverage. So it was fascinating. Certainly, to your question, Jeff, about insurance groups paying out ransoms, I think I don't think that's a sustainable model, right? Because you are. It's not like you're incentivizing ransomware payments, but you're certainly you're making it easier for the business to pay, and that may make it more reliable to receive the payment. Um,
Sure. And to be clear, I don't necessarily have a problem with a company paying a ransom. Um, I mean, I'm not sure that's a great idea because I think a lot of companies don't realize that paying the ransom doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to get your data back. And at some point in the future, those ransomware folks can still drop your data. So you may be pushing off, the bad event for some time because obviously they need to make this transaction feel transactional. but it's not like they're going to necessarily delete that data like they tell you they're going to delete it, right? Um, but but I don't think that I would tell companies they can't pay a ransom. But having the insurance company pay it is different than having the company pay it in my mind.
Sure, and we've seen that ransomware gangs actually do put anyone who pays on a list, and they retarget them for an additional ransom 6 months later, or some short period of time later. So once you've established yourself as someone who's willing to pay a ransom, you're actually going to receive more interest from ransomware gangs, because they know that if they can compromise you again, that you're more likely to receive a payout.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Everybody's focused on recurring revenue, even the hackers.
That's a really great point, Jillian. Do we have any comments? Maybe we should make this a little bit more of a roundtable. Do we have any comments on this particular question from Jillian or from Adi?
Sure. So,
go
ahead.
All right. The one thing I'd say is that it's kind of like there's multiple pressures, right? There's like the regulatory notification, the either employee, consumer data has been breached, and there's like the pressure of notification there, and then a potential class action downstream from that. Like that's one pressure. And then the other pressure in a ransomware scenario is just you got to get your business back up and running again, and there is a daily cost to your business being down. So while it's like really high-minded sometimes to like talk about like not paying the ransom, if it gets to be a pretty cold calculation when you say it's X number of dollars that we lose per day of being down. If we go to past a certain threshold, we risk losing X and Y and Z clients, and that starts to threaten our business in even bigger ways. So at that point, like it's not as much. I mean, and if you're a big public company, you have a fiduciary responsibility to make the right business decision for your company anyway. So it becomes pretty clear just from a dollars and cents standpoint that like pay the ransom, button it up, and hope it like and take steps to make sure it doesn't happen again. But a lot of times, the ransom being paid, it comes from a fiduciary responsibility to the business to get back up and running again, not so much a belief that these are such ethical threat actors that they're going to delete the data and behave. I mean, they are professionalizing, mind you. I mean, they have like HR departments increasingly, and they are trying to like it's surreal the degree to which the threat actors are professionalizing. But I have a lot of empathy for people paying the ransom because of how straightforward it is and how much you're almost legally required to do so from your fiduciary responsibility to the business.
So if I can hop into that, and I just realized I didn't introduce myself earlier. I'm Jillian Bomarito. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Licenzio. And I would add that there's kind of a tension between the fiduciary duty and the fact that it can be a felony to make the payment.
Yep.
And there's also, I don't know if... I don't think this has really gone anywhere, but there was a bill introduced in, I think, October of last year to require companies to report within, I believe it was 48 hours if they made a payment for ransomware. And it opens up a whole new can of worms, kind of regardless of what you do. And I think part of it speaks to the right approach is to do what your company has decided it's going to do, which means that before any of this happens, and kind of as you spoke about earlier, Christian, it's almost certainly going to happen to your company. You need to basically be operating under the assumption of when, not if, and say, when this happens, what are we going to do, and have a plan in place so that you're not scrambling to debate, do we pay it, don't we pay it? If we do, this is what we are, like you can't really flip flop on it. So thinking about it before it happens is essential. And then also I was going to add the piece about, Jeff, when you had said that there's kind of been some court cases that make companies not really want to kind of even look at this, like just turn a blind eye to it. I would say that's really important to get your counsel involved immediately. If you have external counsel and do the investigation through them, then it would be privileged or involving the legal department internally to make sure it's not just, the IT department going off and discovering a lot of bad things without any protection in place beforehand, which again just speaks to you got to plan for this before it happens.
Correct. Yeah. I think that's exactly right, Jillian. You've got to plan ahead so that you know exactly how to make those steps so that you can keep whatever information you have privileged, or else you've potentially stepped on a landmine there, right?
And I think to Jill's point, you have to, the insurance companies require this straight up, but you have to have a seasoned attorney quarterbacking this whole thing, and not your normal relationship partner who handles general stuff, but a seasoned cyber privacy attorney who knows exactly what they're doing. And this is tens or hundreds of numbers of these that they've worked on, are going to advise you about what's legal and not legal, and which ransoms can be paid or can't be paid, and that they're going to be quarterbacking that whole situation. You definitely never want IT kind of going rogue. And to the other point, I would say it's a little bit of both, in that 100% you have to plan, go through the actions of the tabletop exercises, plan for it, make sure you know where all the documentation is that you'd be calling up. And at the same time, realize that, like, the Mike Tyson quote is absolutely true, is everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. And the truth of the matter is, when it's you and you're looking at a specific event that happens, you're going to have to deal with that. And there's going to be flow charts of, oh, well, this is the amount of money and this is the situation. And the fact that you've done all that work ahead of time will still help you make good decisions. And now you're going to also, though, have that attorney on the, like, who's going to be advising you too and giving you great advice throughout.
Yeah. One thing I don't think anybody's mentioned yet is that, these ransoms aren't $1 billion. They're designed to be payable.
Yep.
They've done a cost benefit analysis. These guys are very professional, as Adi has said a couple of times. The ransoms are low. They're intentionally easy to pay.
Yeah, if anything, there's a weird dance going on between our side of the house of preventing and reacting to, and their side of the house to, like, because they don't, the threat actors don't want insurance companies getting out of this business. Like, they actually, like, have an interest in keeping this gravy train going for them, even though all of us have an interest in stopping it and preventing it and to trying to keep up as much as possible. But it's definitely, it would be great if this just didn't become an ongoing tax on all business, but it's increasingly looking like that's what's going to happen.
Yeah.
To your point, Adi, you mentioned a lot of great things that a company can do to plan for and prepare for ransomware. But to Jeff's point, if I have insurance, that sounds like a lot of work that I don't really want to do. And doesn't the insurance take care of it? And one thing that I forgot to mention, the only reason I got cyber insurance, right, was because everyone told me it was reasonable and customary and it was standard. So, it creates a bit of a problem when you release this standard best practice insurance and then you lose money and then you drop everyone from coverage and they're no longer following best practice. So I think it's going to be very difficult for insurance to figure out how to maintain this type of coverage when it's a loss leader, but now it's considered standard.
Yeah, the question is always, what are they covering, right? So what do they actually pay out? Because if you look at history, so Uber paid 148 million in fines because they covered up the data breach for some time that happened. And same happened obviously to Yahoo, a little bit smaller fine, 85 million same year, 2018. And then most people will have heard and or be affected in the Equifax hack, which the proposed settlement there is 575 million. And I'm actually going back and forth with the administrator just to be annoying, and also kind of trying to put a pin into that and to figure out what is the communication that we're getting from there. It's kind of a learning exercise. But here in California, companies actually are required by law to report these hacks in quote unquote the most expedient time possible and without unreasonable delay. So always, needless to say, subject to interpretation, as in if, when, where my stock price might be affected by reporting this, I might be reluctant and I might find it reasonable to delay this after the earnings call, right?
Yeah, that's a great point, Christian. I think it was the Target data breach, maybe, was the first breach that actually ended up with an executive being fired. Was that? I think that was the first one, maybe. And then Equifax obviously there was a lot of executive fallout from that breach. A couple of people resigned, a couple of people got fired. But you don't normally see physical people taking the hit for data breaches. And it seems actually to be happening less and less now. That sort of gets shrugged off. And even worse, stock prices generally tend to bounce back, at least for larger companies. A lot of smaller companies, if they take a breach, will end up going under. But large companies just bounce back. There's an interesting anecdote. I've heard of groups of CISOs that actively invest based upon data breach information. So they'll hear about a data breach that's hit some large company, and after the stock starts to go down based upon that breach becoming public, they will invest in that company knowing the stock will bounce back.
Well,
and they've been very successful with that stock investing strategy.
Well, and famously in that Equifax hack, one of the executives actually made the mistake to sell $1 million worth of stock. Literally the day before the announcement was made.
Yeah, well, that was a very dumb mistake, right?
Jenny Ying has been indicted on insider.
And so, yeah.
If you're an insider, you can't do that, but as an outsider, you can, right?
Sure.
Jeff, I'd say,
hint, hint, Steve, there's a business model.
Yeah, we've been contacted by people that are looking for leading edge reports on who's actually being breached and ransomed. But to paint an even worse picture, Jeff, unfortunately, there's some companies that end up making money because they've been breached. Some companies have had an increase in their PR where businesses didn't even know they existed. There's a data breach that happened recently, to pick on Wawa. They ended up paying out in gift cards. So they didn't actually give out any cash to anyone. They gave out the impacted individuals. I think there's a little bit of cash, but they ended up paying out to affected individuals like $5 gift cards. And I would say that's almost a marketing expense. If you can get someone in the store for $5, you're potentially going to be making money off the breach. And so it's not often that these companies end up hurting from these events.
Interesting.
So I wanted to add something when you were talking earlier about in terms of possibly waiting to disclose until after there's been an earnings report or something. But with the SEC's, I can't remember if it was finalized, but the regulation requiring public companies to disclose a material breach within, I believe, 4 days. And I was looking earlier this year at 8Ks, looking at the material disclosures. When Square had the breach, they disclosed it in item 8.01. And so I think that that's, at least going forward, probably not going to be an option. But as you just discussed, in a lot of cases, it seems like it's a pretty short-term financial impact that it even has for the companies that can weather that dip.
Yeah, that was just recently proposed by the SEC. I don't think that's enacted yet, but yes, the SEC pushed this out in March.
It is interesting that there's been a lot of talk so far, not a lot of past legislation about data breach reporting for government organizations, for critical infrastructure, for financial orgs, for really the industry, for all businesses, but maybe more pressure on those particular things, but very little actual action. Um, I think it's probably going to take, some critical infrastructure like Colonial Pipeline to actually go down again before we actually see any action. Any thoughts on that, guys?
So Colonial Pipeline happened about a year ago, and everyone was very upset when it happened. But I think that we have such a short-term memory that we've all moved on, and I think that we're in an odd spot where privacy laws are very popular to pass, but they're very unpopular to enforce. Because if you are actively pursuing these laws, you can maybe be considered a anti-business state. I think that we have two warring factions, privacy and consumer protection, but then also states that are trying to attract businesses.
Yeah, that's certainly the prevailing wisdom, though I've seen it a little bit flip-floppy and a little bit fuzzy in some of the state legislatures, Steve. There was actually, I'm forgetting which state it was, one of the southern Bible Belt states in the past legislative session. There was actually a bill that was sponsored by Republicans that had a private right of action, and the Democrats in that state legislature were against it. And it was sort of topsy-turvy world, which was really strange because the Republican legislature was essentially being anti-business and the Democrats were being pro-business, because everyone seems to be more pro-privacy rights at this point in time. But who's actually in favor of particular amendments is a little bit up in the air, which is very strange. But in general, you're certainly right. It's still that way.
Well, and certainly there's the law, which there's a lot of room for improvement in the law, especially nationally. But then there's the enforcement of the law, and we've looked into this. I just don't see DOJ offices enforcing these laws in an aggressive manner. Some of these laws don't even require disclosure to the public of exactly who's been breached. It's been a constant complaint of mine around GDPR is the breach disclosures go to the government, but then they never actually go to the public, or they're never visible to see who's been breached from a company perspective. So it's interesting to see how the laws are actually being enforced, and then what do the general consumers actually get from these laws.
Yeah, I mean, by and large, the way I look at this, enforcement actions are being taken if that's a for-profit enterprise, right? As in, if and when and where it's profitable for that agency to act, and they can actually get some fines from that entity. And I think that's a big part of the consideration. It's really not about protecting consumers by and large, unfortunately. At least that's my impression. No, correct me if you see it differently.
What do we think? What does the panel here today think about breach monitoring services, and that being sort of the way that the businesses are making up for their breaches? It seems to me that that's a carrot that they're throwing to consumers that really doesn't have a whole lot of value anymore.
Yeah, wasn't it like Equifax or one of the big like credit monitoring agencies is like, now I saw some recent campaign about like going into that, and I was like, you were the one who was breached, and like now people are supposed to trust you to to catch it. I mean, I guess on the one hand, very well like what happens, but on the other hand, like I don't think I would personally trust you for that.
Well, yeah, all the credit monitoring services are offering breach breach detection services, and premium ones at that.
Mhm.
But other organizations are doing it too.
I mean, it's a common throw-in to the packages. It's a common way to say that we're doing stuff. And I mean, I think for a lot of like end consumers and people who have become a part of these, you may have several of these offered to you at any given time. And it's no doubt that the public and all of us are also individual members of the public who have been a part of these. Is everyone kind of has breach fatigue, and everyone like, what am I supposed to be doing? Like constantly signing up for more credit monitoring services or something. So yeah, I mean, on one hand, I understand like it's
No,
not an individual breach that you can throw in, but on the tangible world, like what are we all covered like 4 different times from these? Like okay.
Yeah, the identity theft protection became a let's give them something type of response.
Yep.
And there were some very successful companies that sold policies, $0 policies that said, hey, when you're breached, just give them a year of our ID theft protection. And they were just betting that they would be breached and then they'd make money after the fact. And it's become one of these best practices that arguably doesn't really do anything. A year of credit monitoring doesn't impact me when I've just had my social security number stolen, and that could be exploited for the rest of my life. And there's a lot that hackers can do with the data that is not at all covered by identity theft protection, specifically medical fraud. Is very concerning, and that's not at all related to credit monitoring. So yeah, I have about 4 of these services. They're constantly monitoring me, but I don't really count them for much. It's sort of a placeholder that makes me maybe feel good that when my identity is stolen, I might have a call center that can help.
Yeah, that's the way I sort of see it too, Steve. Is it does have some value, but that value is pretty limited. What I've always found is that it's probably better to simply freeze your credit, which can be done for free. And it seems to me that maybe
But
that's
also requires you to send them your social security number. I believe if they haven't changed it, still through the mail to a mailbox that's. I wouldn't be surprised if there are frequent issues with interceptions, perhaps.
Yeah. I don't think you always have to do that, but to prove your identity, you do often have to do that. For a lot of people will. Yeah.
Yeah, we
I
were
mean, I
talking
think
about
this
this
is
the
like-
other day. So the social security number in the United States is probably the most compromised single unifier in the world at this point in time.
Yeah, you know when your dentist office asks you for that, then it's not a good secure
I know,
thing.
my understanding is that they actually not even allowed to ask. Right? And that holds true, and I told this story many times for your bank as well. So when a bank teller actually tells you that you're legally required to provide the social security number, what he's actually doing from a legal perspective is committing a felony, because it's under the color of law that he tells you that he or she is required to give you this instrument when that actually is not true at all, right? So there's no law that requires you even to have a social security number. You can opt out of that, and you should. It's a Ponzi scheme, right? There's no reason to do that. But we just by and large made it very impractical, because all of these entities just insist on using this as a single identifier.
Yeah. If I was anyone who thought they'd been breached, I would just assume that your social security number has been compromised. In fact, if you think that you're at risk, you should probably freeze your credit now. You should just have your credit frozen. If you're not in the market for buying a house or buying a car, there's no reason that you actually need to have your credit unfrozen. You're much lower risk profile if you just freeze your credit all the time. Tony, do you have a question? I can bring you on board here if you'd like to talk.
Nice. I do have a question. It seems like all of these things are super relevant because they're taking place in the present, these breaches and all the dirty secrets that we've heard so far. What does anybody see that, it seems like these conversations will be irrelevant in an environment where individuals are in control of their own personal graph, and we have a distributed or decentralized kind of experience from the end users. And is there anything on the horizon or any projects that you guys know currently that would concur with that or not?
Yeah, I mean, there are dozens of projects that are trying to tackle this problem. We probably looked at about 150 or so over the last 5 years. A lot of them are kind of what I would call the cart before the horse, because unfortunately, because by and large in today's society we require nation-state enforcement for the transfer of value, and they give you nation-state credentials, right? So when you open up a bank account, you need to provide your driver's license or your passport, and now we have states that issue these as digitally native instruments, and so we have the chance to establish that, but we are still very early in that realm, as you, I think, already know. But unfortunately, a lot of startups that we're seeing kind of trying to develop something without paying attention to these existing data streams, and then these new kind of, I'll call them cryptographic primitives, which is not always true from a technical perspective. But yeah, that's how I see the evolution of kind of digital technologies as, and we need to reverse the topology of the current internet. What I mean by that is specifically, we have this push system right now, where everything is being pushed in front of you rather than you are pulling it in to do something, right? There's on average like 4,000 or 5,000, and Jeff can correct me on the actual number, databases that have more records, more personal identifiable data on you than you ever had in your life. And then they use that typically to profile you, so to social engineer you into doing something. Point of that exercise being as we really, really, really urgently need to reverse that to where what I call you own all of your digital dust. So as a starting point, look at everything that's on your driver's license. So that makes up you. And then as a second point to that, anything that's kind of biometric related. So there shouldn't be copies of that out there. And actually, we're trying to find the right angle here, and Steve and I have talked about that, and we've talked to other projects about that, how to actually make these solutions a profit center, to where you can think of solutions that right now, like Getty Images, for example, they have crawlers and a dozen law firms, and their main business model is to find people that use their particular images in a way where the website owner hasn't paid for that, and then they send them a nice letter saying, oh, we found the Getty image on your website, you owe us $10,000, and the letter's coming from a law firm, you got 30 days to pay that, or we're going to take you to court. A point of this example being is, I would love to see something similar for every individual on the planet. It's like, well, I haven't consented to my likeness being associated to whatever other records, and you shouldn't have this in the first place. That's $10,000 fine. Send it to me, remove that, and also testify to the fact that you have forever deleted this, including from all of your backups. Anyway, so Jeff, always when I get into these rants, feel free to stop me. You know, I'm very excited about all these topics, since I've been working on this for more than a decade at this point.
I thought that was good.
Thank you for sharing that.
Tony, you know me, it's like, I'll never pull punches. Jillian wants to say something.
I was going to add to that to some degree, it only solves future problems. It doesn't, anything that's already out there, which is a lot, is still going to be out there regardless. Now, that being said, I am all for, where we can control the information that's being shared. Our stuff might be out there, but our kids and our grandkids, like if we can create a system in which they can, not have to be a social pariah that only pays in cash and wears, hats pulled down over their eyes so nobody knows who they are, and they can interact with everybody without exposing information indiscriminately about themselves, where they can opt into that. I think that's great. I was going to say, I totally agree with you that you have to have the nation states kind of pushing that to make it really possible. But then you have the issue where they're the ones selling the data, like all of the DMVs that will sell driver's license information to like surveillance companies. And it's just, there's so many other issues out there that it seems like unless there's some big systemic change, it's going to be hard to completely stop the flow. But I also think that where we can, let's try to do that. Let's get that technology in place so that it's not every single opportunity you're exposing all of your information.
Yeah, Jeff and I call it the do not call list on all your data. So if when where you're issuing new type of credentials, then you kind of establish this is the one single credential that has this particular combination of information on there. If someone else has that, then he, she, it has it unlawfully. You need to show that you consented to having a copy of that because we're going to reset the system. Right? So by and large, and that is more technical discussion,
I was going to say, we've talked about that kind of in the context of when companies are getting data from a third party. We call it a DBOM, data bill of materials, similar to with software, basically tracing the provenance of that data to make sure, like you said, that there was consent in there at some point, and tracing, like maybe consent was given to party A, but not to share with party B, who now has it.
Yeah, we just need to make it infeasible, right? So as in, it's too costly that at that point in time when it comes out that you have this, what we call toxic data, that at that point in time, we just need to really establish some examples. I would love to see someone like Mark Zuckerberg, for example, go to prison for life. I think that's where he needs to be, right? For what he's doing. And I think we have a lot of people that would agree with that statement. And I think it's just a matter of us actually showing the externalities of these solutions, right? And unfortunately, some of that is simply an externality of legacy technology of database solutions, right? Because we invented database solutions in the early 60s before we invented network solutions. So we attach those data silos to networks without really thinking about the consequences.
Yeah.
I think to Jillian's point that there are some common steps that we can take to reduce our risk. We're in a situation where whatever piece of data you hand over to a company, you can't trust that they're going to safeguard it. So the question is, how many false pieces of information can you give them while still getting the service you want, right? The problem we often see isn't always data that's been provided through an official manner, but data that's been volunteered, right? If you sign up for free golf clubs or free golf lessons, or you sign up for a social network, you end up volunteering a lot of information that when taken together can profile you and potentially be used against you. And so one of the common pieces of advice that I give is, whenever possible, lie. Just make a fake persona and lie. There's no reason that the New York Times needs to know your real name and home address. But it is a scenario where you just really can't trust that the data is going to be well governed until there is a better system in place that gives you control.
Yeah, well, we need a lot more easier tools. I mean, all these tools to mitigate against that exist, but they are just by and large not very user friendly, unfortunately. I think most people on this call probably using things like privacy.com, right, where you're creating a new credit card. If you're not using it, use it. I think it's one of the most useful services out there. I always create a new credit card for whenever I engage with a new merchant and immediately set the parameters for that. And what's kind of ironic is I did this trial at Experian creating a new credit card and set it to whatever the minimum was that they needed to do something. And I think I got alerts for another 6 months for Experian trying to charge that particular card, because every time it gets denied, you get an email from privacy.com. Which, from where I'm sitting, is it's attempted fraud. So again, it's a matter of us developing solutions that basically fight fire with fire, because these companies all have systems that automate all of their activities, and whenever you're trying to engage with them as an individual, you get a kind of boilerplate answer, or if you're getting an answer at all, and then you might send another letter, and then it will take another month for them to send you yet another boilerplate answer. Probably everybody has had this experience at some point in time. But yeah, that's where I always call to action. If you're working on solutions in that space, or if you're thinking about working on solutions in the space, reach out to me, and we'll share our thoughts, and if it's value, might even make an investment in that.
That's interesting about the credit.com. I've actually used that as well, Christian, and I do like it. If people don't understand that service, you can take your credit card to credit.com and generate additional credit card numbers, essentially meta credit card numbers with smaller amounts that are associated with it. So you can then go online and have a credit card that only has a limit of $500 or something like that to use online. And if somebody was to steal that number, then essentially they've stolen a fake credit card that has a very limited balance on it.
Yeah, that's one. Yeah, Jeff, I was actually referring to privacy.com. They do this, but yeah, credit.com is also useful. Also, privacy.com just spun this credit card generation thing out as a separate service. So if you're a solutions provider, something to look into. I think that should happen every single time, right? Yeah. And then, as an extension of that, we had a meeting about this yesterday. What I'd love to see is actually that whenever a cash transaction is possible, so to speak, you want to virtually organize that, as in where you detach things from your account, because the problem that still exists with things like privacy.com is you are attaching your bank account to it. So that's now they are the ones that have this particular honeypot. So ideally you would have an intermediary step in there where you have something like a non-custodial wallet with a digital bearer instrument that funds this particular credit card, and you do every single payment like that, right? Like you would do in-person cash payments.
I would think overall, though, any solution that, if you play this out, wherever you get to, I don't think it's reasonable to expect individuals like the billions of us as just regular humans to be privacy experts and to be thinking about this even a little bit every day in and day out. The moment you're asking individuals to authorize all these things and go over here, I think the solution has to, no matter what, has to assume threat actors are doing a whole bunch of stuff, and everybody, all the regular civilians, so to speak, just want to go about their life.
Yeah.
Even though
don't even tell them.
I don't want to be authorizing stuff.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
the cookie consent is an easy example of that. Well-meaning, but completely disastrous, and just has taught to endlessly accept these dialogues. And it's basically made everyone tune out to the very thing it was trying to. All of these authorizations and all of these endless dialogues, it has just made people numb to it. And that is in a lot of ways a prime example of how not to handle it.
Yeah. So one point here, maybe to expand this discussion a little bit. So people's eyes usually glare over when you use the term privacy, right? So that's why I always try to put this into a different context, and most people might have heard me talk about this. So we are supporting the efforts of certain non-government organizations, NGOs, that facilitate value and information transfer to people that live under authoritarian governments. So point there being is that these people cannot use technologies that expose them, right? Where they can be de-anonymized because they are saying something that, or doing something that the government disagrees with, and in our case that might be fine and the government won't come after us, but half of the world doesn't have that luxury, to where if and when and where they will be found out, those people best case will be disenfranchised and can no longer participate in financial transactions online, and worst case they are being disappeared. So that is my framework for all digital solutions.
Well, I don't think you're going to find a digital solution that fits in PRC and fits in like the Western world, because there's just different mindsets. I mean, if you're literally trying to like evade the PRC, you're already in deep different territory than a person who just wants to get their Instacart transaction delivered in Poughkeepsie. Like,
yeah,
that's just
I don't
like,
think that's
Some
optional.
people,
No, I don't think
some
it's
people
optional.
have that. Yeah, I agree with you completely. Some people have that. Why should those protections only be granted to the few? Like Christian's saying, that belongs to every human being on earth, I believe. And as developers, we should be striving towards that as an ideal or a benchmark for how we're developing our solutions in Web3.
Yeah, let me broaden the question here, guys. You can't really have privacy without security. Are all the laws for data security that say a company should have reasonable security, are those just too damn weak? Is reasonable security say anything anymore?
Oh, I completely agree. The laws are a minimum standard, but then on top of the laws are the regulations, right? PCI DSS for credit cards, and then FDIC for banks. But even those are very loosely written, right? There's a lot of leeway there. There are certain parts that are intentionally written without teeth, and then the best practices, the regulations, the standards, that they're not updated all that frequently, right? So you think of how quickly healthcare is changing and healthcare records are changing, but is HIPAA keeping up with all those changes as well? So I think that there's a lot of room for improvement in these regulations that have much more of an impact on what businesses do. If the standard of care that HIPAA has for a patient's record, right, there's an actual fine for exposing that record. If that was applied to all other industries, I think you'd see far fewer records being exposed.
I think that's a lot harder to do, though, because healthcare information in particular, depending on what exactly it is that gets exposed, generally has fewer I guess, possible origins. Whereas if there is a breach and your social security number gets out, it's really, really hard to basically to document that there was harm from that specific breach, because they're going to argue that information was likely already breached. It was out there. You can't say that this particular breach is why it's out there. I'm not at fault. You have no harm. You can't come after me. So it's, unless there is some better way to actually demonstrate harm, it's like, regardless of what the regulations, well, I guess if it's the government, then there's less of the question about harm. But like, if there's precedent about what it takes to show harm from a breach, such that like consumers can directly go after the companies, I think that would actually, like, if there's private action available without needing to show direct harm that this breach led to this data being out, I think we'd see a lot more of that, and potentially it would incentivize companies to step up their security. But again, who knows? They might just say, the cost of that, like the cost of actually doing it the right way, is going to outweigh the potential lawsuit.
Yeah. Should we have fines for losing the records even if there's no harm?
I think so.
We should
Although
remove.
that's kind of a slippery slope, because then like what happens is it only if it's PII, but there's no harm? Is it, what if it's instead of personal data, what if it's a company's proprietary information that's leaked? And that's, I mean, that's kind of a different,
Yeah,
like a whole different area.
It's a tough calculus. You're right.
And get to the dirty secrets. One of the dirty secrets about data breaches is it's really complicated and there's no easy answers right now. There's no like, this jurisdiction has it completely perfect, or this one, like we're still pretty early on in this and figuring out what the stasis is going to be. Are we ever going to defeat this, or is it going to be like spam or some other thing that just is this persistent thing in the background that we kind of manage, and it's just attacks on everything between threat actors and businesses and consumers and governments, and it all just is kind of there and fractured. I don't know, like it seems that way. Like the dirty secret seems to be, it seems like it's just going to be attacks on business. Hopefully not. Hopefully we can stop it, or like, but that seems to be it, because there's no easy answers right now. There's no like one size fits all. There's no, this is what everyone should do. It's a TikTok, it's a cat and mouse game.
Yeah.
It's interesting, if I may make one more contribution, there's a parallel that I see going on in a project that I'm working on with respect to regulation. And there is, you guys you're talking about, solutions in the context of how they fit into the existing guidelines. And to me, it seems like those guidelines are a subset of what should be important. Like the actual target is much higher than those minimum standards that come from bureaucrats and regulation. And so the parallel is I'm working on a project in the legacy cannabis ecosystem up in Oregon on a wholesale marketplace. And part of the equation is their compliance as the custody of the product moves from one license holder to the next. And so we engaged a company called Avery Dennison to look at their track and trace solution and do some metric integration, because the data that was available from the, related to the product data, the metric, the minimum standards requirements of the regulator is just a subset of the rich data that's there. It's like insignificant. So we're aiming to go for what the ideal is, and then complying with regulations is there. If we designed our solution around, focusing on what the regulation requires, we're going to get a substandard product. We're going to miss the mark. So I encourage everybody to stop looking at the regulation and think more about the ideals. What new tracks do we have to build in order to have a world where everybody's in control of their data and identity? Because contributing, just bolting shit onto the existing infrastructure is a waste of time, in my opinion. I mean, we all know jobs.
Like, I think that's kind of a straw man. Like, I don't think people are just looking at the regulations in a vacuum. I think they're looking at the regulations as something that has to be respected legally. So that is one part of it. But if you look at, like, is an easy example of what insurance companies are looking at, they're almost becoming a de facto certification, because on the underwriting side, here's people with an economic interest to make sure that anyone that they cover at least is doing as many things as they can think of to prevent a data breach or an incident. So their economic interest is extremely like good practices as much as possible. And do they get it right all the time? Absolutely not. Nobody can. But they're definitely not just looking at the regulations. They're looking at like all sorts of that's why I say it's like a de facto certification that underwriters are having to come up with to figure out who to insure. And it's well beyond the regulations.
Yeah, I agree with you there, Adi. I think the insurers are starting to get pretty wise.
Yeah.
They have to. Like, it's their like, without it, they can't really underwrite a policy at this point without borderline certifying a company's security. I mean, that's what's weird about it, is like the insurers are becoming de facto certification providers.
I don't know. I feel like their standard, like it's kind of like literally a check the box exercise. Like you're certifying to them, I'm doing these things. They're generally not going in and checking that. But I mean, it might change. They might require, like, we're only going to certify you if you have ISO 27001 certification. That's a good way to outsource. Like, you have to do the work, but we have some real signal that it's been tested. And I assume real change might be pushed down even from the reinsurers, because they might say, like, you guys have a bunch of like junk coverage for these companies that aren't doing enough, like, step it up.
Absolutely. I mean, these are just the people with like a huge economic interest in making sure that a subset of corporations are protecting data well, because like they lose if these events happen. They win if the technology prevents an incident, and they lose if incidents happen and they're having to pay out on all these policies.
Could we? I know we're over time here, guys, but one last question: Could we improve security by requiring that people had insurance and requiring that the insurers had some minimum standard like ISO?
It would just get really expensive really fast, because if you require insurance, then the insurance providers will make the insurance so expensive that, and requiring ISO, by the way, can be very expensive also. Like a non-trivial process.
I don't know. I mean, we did it for our last company, and it can be done. I mean, it's absolutely not cheap. And there's a lot of companies that would just be like, okay, guess I don't have insurance. And honestly, those are the ones that are the small companies that if they have a breach, they're going under anyway, which is not to say that they shouldn't have insurance or shouldn't have whatever, but
it's a dice roll.
Yeah.
True. All right, we need to wrap this up, folks. We're over time. This has been really enlightening. I learned a lot. I hope our audience has as well. Any last minute thoughts? Chris, you want to say anything?
Yeah, I mean, for those who've listened to any of my talks, you already heard that, so you can hang up at this point. But no, I taught privacy law right out after law school, like more than 20 years ago. And there was like shortly before or after GDPR was enacted. And GDPR has kind of this quaint requirement of the quote-unquote right to be forgotten. From a technologist's perspective, that's just simply naive, right? Anything digitally observed is not ever going to be forgotten. It's immediately duplicated and distributed. Larger point there being is we should ask ourselves, and the regulator should ask ourselves, don't we have as human beings the unalienable right not to be observed? Because even just observation changes behavior, and by and large, there is no reason for these digital records to exist outside of that commercial interest of that company that thinks of it as data is oil, which is one of the most horrific statements that was ever uttered, in my opinion, right? Because, it's been used against us more than it's been serving us.
It's just wrong too. It's just like a dumb it's kind of a dumb glib statement.
Yeah.
Like, data's not oil.
Yeah.
Like, it's just not. Oil is oil.
Yeah, we could go on a long rant about that. All right, folks, this has been wonderful. Appreciate your attendance and your interaction, and hope you have a great weekend.
Join us again next week.
Yes.
Take
care, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everybody.